All right, strap in, because today we're not just, tweaking the historical narrative. We're going straight for the foundations of reality, as you probably understand it.
Yeah, this is a big one. You've been sold this story, right? Perpetual progress, forward motion. Technology gets better, society gets more enlightened, knowledge just keeps stacking up, we're always climbing.
Always getting better, but what if? What if that's not just wrong? What if it's the opposite of what's actually happening?
Prepare for a major paradigm shift, because we're diving into some sources, ancient wisdom really, that makes an absolutely astonishing claim. This modern world, all its complexity, its speed, its scientific marvels, it's not the peak.
Not even close. The terms used are pretty blunt. An anomaly, even a monstrosity.
Yeah.
And why? Because it's built on, get this, the negation of principle.
And look, this isn't about Democrat versus Republican or left versus right. This goes way deeper. It's a kind of metaphysical diagnosis of our entire civilization.
Think about the chaos you see everywhere.
Yeah.
The social fragmentation, the sheer noise, the anxiety.
What if that's not just bad luck or bad policies? What if it's the totally predictable, inevitable symptom of a cosmic law we've completely forgotten? A law that says things don't just go up forever.
Exactly. What if we're actually living through a kind of, a fall, a necessary downward slide dictated by vast cycles of time?
The current crisis, a symptom of a cosmic law.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's way older than that concept. To get why our age might be called a monstrosity, we have to look at this alternative view of time.
Right, not the straight line moving forward that we usually imagine.
No, think cyclic, like a great wheel turning. This comes from loads of ancient traditions. You see it in the Hindu concept of the Manvantara, the great cycle of humanity, but also echoes in, say, the Greek ages of man.
So how does this cycle work? Is it just random ups and downs?
Not random at all. It's described as a descent through 4 distinct ages. Always starting high, always ending low. You have a golden age, pure spirit, super connected to the source.
That's nice.
Doesn't it? Then a silver age, still spiritual, but maybe more intellectualized. Then a bronze age, think heroes, power, more focus on earthly things, rituals. And finally,
the Iron Age. Doesn't sound promising.
It's not meant to. Each age represents a step further down, a move away from that initial spiritual principle.
Yeah.
The sources call it a progressive materialization.
Materialization, like getting denser, more focused on just stuff.
Exactly. Denser, faster, darker. Things get more complex on the surface, but further from the unifying core, like gravity pulling everything down and apart as the cycle winds down.
Okay, so where are we in this grand cosmic Ferris wheel ride? Please don't say the Iron Age.
Well, according to these traditions, we're deep in it. Not just the Iron Age, but the final, most intense phase of it. They call it the Kali-Yuga, the Dark Age, the Age of Conflict.
Kali-Yuga. Wow. Okay, so that's not just like a bad mood the world's in. It's a specific cosmic time frame.
It's presented as a precise diagnosis. An age foretold across cultures, characterized by dissolution, confusion, and spiritual obscurity. And the sources suggest we're not just in it, we're nearing its climax.
Right. That explains a lot, maybe.
Yeah.
But what defines this decline? Is it just everyone becoming evil, like Mad Max time?
That's what you might think. Right. Moral collapse. But the sources make a really crucial distinction here, and this is key.
Okay.
The primary crisis isn't necessarily moral degradation, though that definitely happens as a consequence. The root problem, the absolute core catastrophe, is defined as a degradation of knowledge, a perversion of the intellect itself.
Wait, so it's not about bad intentions, it's about bad thinking. Or not being able to think straight.
Pretty much. It's like the very principles that govern reality, the nature of truth itself, becomes so clouded, so obscured, that we literally forget what truth means.
We lose the ability to grasp universal, absolute truths. We get stuck in opinions, relativity.
Exactly. You see it everywhere, right? My truth, your truth. The idea of a single overarching truth becomes almost incomprehensible. And if the intellect itself is corrupted at the root,
then everything built on it, our science, our society, our culture is fundamentally unstable. It's built on shaky ground, heading towards, well, you said it earlier.
An inevitable cataclysm, a dissolution, because the foundations are rotten.
Okay, that is a profoundly disturbing thought, but also weirdly compelling. It sets up a huge question, doesn't it?
Which is?
If our whole way of thinking is this broken, this anomaly, then what did we lose? What kind of knowledge, what kind of suppressed wisdom, maybe even non-human wisdom, as some sources hinted, previous ages possessed that we've completely forgotten? wisdom that maybe could have prevented this slide?
That's the million-dollar question. And understanding that loss is supposedly the key to navigating the end of this cycle and maybe preserving something for the next.
Okay, so if the root problem is intellectual, a corruption of how we know things, we need to dig into how that happened. What was the fundamental error? And the sources point to this deep internal conflict, like an intellectual civil war.
Yeah, a battle between two fundamental concepts, knowledge and action. Pure understanding versus doing stuff.
And the modern world, according to this view, picked the wrong side.
Dramatically so. It performed a complete reversal of the natural hierarchical order. Traditionally, contemplation, pure knowledge, understanding first principles, the connection to the source was seen as inherently superior. It's the guiding light.
Makes sense. Know what to do before you do it.
Right. But the modern West flipped it. It elevated action doing, making, utility, practical results, constant activity above everything else. Action became the supreme value.
Okay, unpack that. Why is contemplation considered superior in the traditional view?
It goes back to fundamental metaphysics, really. Think Aristotle, even. Pure intellectual knowledge is seen as the unmoved mover. It's the stable principle, the blueprint.
Like the architect's plan for a building.
Perfect analogy. Knowledge is the unchanging plan. It defines the purpose, the structure. Action is just the building process, the hammering, the sawing, the physical effort. It's necessary, but it's transient, it's change.
And the unchanging has to be superior to the changing. The plan has to guide the hammer.
Precisely. If you say the action of hammering is more important than the knowledge of the plan, you're lost. You're just making noise and maybe wrecking the place. The changing can't be logically superior to the unchanging principle that directs it.
Wow, okay, so elevating action over knowledge is like putting the cart before the horse, but on a cosmic scale.
On a civilizational scale. And this is where you see the modern world problems erupt, according to this view. If you ditch the guiding principle, the unmoved mover of knowledge, what does action become?
Directionless.
Yeah.
Chaotic.
Exactly. It degenerates into what the sources call sterile, meaningless agitation. Just constant, frenetic, unending change, completely disconnected from any higher purpose or universal law.
So our obsession with speed, efficiency, productivity, innovation for its own sake
is just the symptom of that deeper intellectual mistake. We're obsessed with how fast we're moving, but we've forgotten why we're moving or where we're supposed to be going. We value the activity itself, regardless of its quality or purpose.
It's like we're driving a car, constantly upgrading the engine to go faster, but we threw the map out the window ages ago, and now we're just speeding towards a cliff, admiring the acceleration.
That's a pretty good image for it, yeah. This constant churning, this focus on fleeting results and practical utility, what the sources called dispersion and multiplicity, it inevitably leads towards final dissolution. Everything fragments because nothing holds it together at the center.
So this reversal, action over knowledge, doing over being, the material over the intellectual, this is the heart of the anti-traditional outlook.
It really is. But here's the kicker. This wasn't a recent mistake. It wasn't the internet or the 20th century or even the Enlightenment, really. We need to trace this back much, much further to find the moment the West truly took that wrong turn. And it's way earlier than most people think.
Okay, so if it wasn't the Enlightenment or the usual suspects, when did this great reversal begin? When did the West supposedly jump the tracks?
The sources we're drawing on point to a surprisingly early date. Not the 16th century with the Reformation, not the 15th with the main Renaissance flourishing, but almost 2 centuries before that. They pinpoint the opening of the 14th century.
The 1300s. Wow, that's much earlier than I expected. What happened then?
It's seen as this hidden turning point, the subtle initial cracking of the traditional worldview. This period marks the real start of what they call the decadence, the beginning of the disruption of Christendom.
Christendom meaning not just the church as an institution, but the whole metaphysical and social order it represented in the West.
Exactly. Imperfect as it was, it provided a framework grounded in theoretically superhuman principles. The early 14th century saw the beginning of its serious fragmentation, the philosophical seeds of individualism and secularism being sown within the universities, long before they became widespread cultural forces.
Can we get more specific? What kind of philosophical shifts happened then? Were people suddenly declaring action was better than knowledge?
It was more subtle initially. You see the rise of things like nominalism, the idea that universal concepts like humanity or justice aren't real in themselves, or just names we give to collections of individuals.
Okay, how does that lead to problems?
Well, if universals aren't real, then only individual things are. It starts to chip away at the idea of universal truth, universal principles. It elevates the particular over the general. You also see shifts towards voluntarism, emphasizing God's will over God's intellect. Again, subtle, but it starts paving the way for later elevating human will and action over stable intellectual principles.
So little cracks in the intellectual foundation that would widen over centuries.
Precisely. Laying the groundwork for the more obvious shifts later. And the movement that really codified this changing attitude, even if it wasn't the absolute start, was the Renaissance.
Which we usually celebrate as this great rebirth, right? Rediscovering classical knowledge.
Celebrated, yes. But from this traditional perspective, it wasn't so much a rebirth as, well, a crucial step down. It formalized the decline through humanism.
Humanism? That sounds positive.
Yeah.
Focus on human potential, human dignity.
And that's the appeal. But the argument here is that humanism, in practice, meant reducing everything, art, philosophy, science, life itself, to purely human proportions.
Meaning taking God or the transcendent out of the equation. Making humanity the ultimate measure of all things.
Essentially, yes. It was a symbolic turning away from the heavens, a focus inward and downward onto the purely human realm, often under the banner of conquering the earth or mastering nature. Man stops being seen as a reflection of a divine order and starts seeing himself as the center and the standard.
Okay, I can see how that connects. If man is the measure, then the individual human becomes paramount, which leads directly to
individualism. And this isn't just about personal freedom. In this context, individualism means the negation of any principle higher than individuality itself.
So, my personal experience, my reason, my feelings become the ultimate authority. There's nothing objectively true above me.
That's the core anti-traditional stance, yes. If the individual ego is the highest court of appeal, then you've fundamentally undermined any possibility of genuine spiritual authority, which must be based on something superhuman, universal, and unchanging.
And chaos ensues.
Yeah.
Because if everyone is their own ultimate authority,
you get intellectual anarchy. Look at modern philosophy, the endless proliferation of contradictory systems, each tied to the name of its inventor. Everyone wants to be original, to create their own truth.
Instead of discovering the truth.
Exactly. In a traditional society, claiming an idea was purely yours would actually discredit it. Truth had to be universal, impersonal. This modern obsession with personal genius and originality is seen as a symptom of this deep intellectual fragmentation caused by individualism.
Okay, so the West takes this individualistic turn, makes humanity the measure. What specific capability did we lose or deny in that process? You mentioned a degradation of knowledge.
This is absolutely crucial. The core intellectual crime, according to these sources, was the denial, the forgetting, the outright rejection of a specific higher faculty of knowing, intellectual intuition.
Intellectual intuition. That sounds important. What exactly is it? Is it like a gut feeling, a hunch?
No, absolutely not. That's a common modern confusion. It's not emotional. It's not subconscious. It's not a vague feeling. It's described as super-rational, above reason.
Super-rational?
Yes, a direct, immediate, infallible form of pure intelligence. It's the faculty that supposedly allows for the direct apprehension of universal metaphysical truths, those first principles we keep talking about. It's the source of that non-human wisdom, the connection to the divine intellect, if you like.
So it's a way of knowing that doesn't rely on step-by-step logic or sensory data. A direct download of truth.
Kind of, yeah. It sees the blueprint, the whole, directly. But you can see why individualism had to deny this, right?
Because it's super individual. It connects you to something universal, beyond your own ego.
Bingo. If you want the individual to be supreme, you must reject a faculty that inherently links the individual to a higher universal reality. It's a threat to the entire individualist project.
So we closed the door on this higher form of knowing. What did we replace it with? What became the highest way of knowing?
This is what the sources call the Great Substitution. Having denied intellectual intuition, the West elevated reason, specifically discursive reason, logic, analysis, the kind of thinking codified by Descartes, for example. Rationalism became the new gold standard.
Reason seems pretty good, though, right? Logic, evidence.
It's useful, but it's purely human. It's relative, indirect. It works by breaking things down into parts. It can analyze the consequences of principles, but it can't grasp the principles themselves directly in the way intellectual intuition supposedly could. So rationalism was the first step down, limiting knowledge to the purely human mind. It created a kind of intellectual prison, albeit a well-organized one.
But it didn't stop there, did it? The descent continued.
Oh, yeah. Once reason was crowned king, it didn't take long for it to be demoted. Its main values shifted towards just practical applications serving technology and industry. And then came the real nosedive, accelerating the materialization we talked about.
Down from reason to
The infrarational, below reason, the basement levels of the psyche.
Okay, like what? What's infrarational?
Think about the rise of sentimentalism as a guide to truth. If it feels good, it must be right. Or appeals to blind instinct. Or think about the fascination with the subconscious as some deep wellspring of wisdom.
Like Bergson's ideas about intuition being tied to life force and instinct. Or William James focusing on subjective religious experience.
Exactly those kinds of things. Confusing true, super-rational intuition with the flux of biological life or subjective emotional states. It's the complete inversion of the proper hierarchy. Starting with divine light, intellectual intuition, limiting it to human Campbellite, reason, and then plunging down into the murky depths of subjective feeling and instinct, infrarational.
Wow. So that's the trajectory that leads to what the sources call profane philosophy and profane science.
Precisely. Modern profane knowledge, meaning knowledge cut off from the sacred, from higher principles, is built on this fundamental limitation. It restricts itself to the lowest order of knowing, empirical observation, measurement, analysis of facts, divorced from principles.
It knows more and more about less and less, essentially. Trapped in the details, unable to see the big picture because it denied the faculty needed to see it.
You got it. It's a self-inflicted blindness. We think we're being objective and rational, but according to this view, we've voluntarily limited ourselves to the shadowlands, mistaking the shadows for reality. And that limitation creates a system of knowledge that is ultimately a profane lie, a collection of facts that might be accurate on their own level, but are fundamentally misleading because they're detached from the deeper truth.
The audacity of this critique is just staggering. Okay, we've got the decline, Kali-Yuga, the core error, action over knowledge, the intellectual self-sabotage, denying intuition. Now we really need to see what kind of world gets built on such a shaky, profane foundation.
Right. Let's dive into the so-called jewel in the crown of modernity, science. We're taught it's the engine of progress, constantly discovering new truths, building on past achievements.
Yeah, the scientific method, exploration, technology seems like clear progress.
But hold on, here is maybe the most radical claim yet from these traditional sources. Modern, specialized sciences, chemistry, physics, astronomy, you name it, are not fundamentally new discoveries building upwards. They are presented as residues, leftovers, corruptions even.
Residues of what?
Of ancient traditional sacred sciences. Sciences that were holistic, multi-leveled, and always connected to metaphysical principles.
So like, modern chemistry isn't an evolution from alchemy, it's a degradation of alchemy.
That's exactly the kind of example given. The term residue is key. Imagine a sacred science was like a complete organism with a spiritual head and heart, the principles, and a physical body, the applications. What happened, according to this view, is that the head and heart were lost. The connection to the intellectual principle was severed.
Leaving just the body, the purely material aspect.
Exactly. The lowest, most outward, most tangible part got isolated, materialized, and then treated as the whole story. And that leftover fragment became the starting point for a completely different kind of development, a purely quantitative material development heading downwards.
Let's stick with that alchemy to chemistry example. How does that work?
Okay, so traditional alchemy in this view wasn't just about literally trying to make gold for profit. That was maybe a misunderstanding even back then for some. True alchemy was a cosmological science dealing with the fundamental nature of substances and transformation, but crucially, it had a spiritual dimension. It was initiatic, meaning the physical processes, heating, dissolving, combining, were symbols. They mirrored an inner spiritual process, the transmutation and perfection of the human soul itself. The goal was philosophical gold, spiritual realization, achieved by understanding the correspondence between the microcosm, human, and the macrocosm, universe.
Okay, that's a very different picture of alchemy. So how did we get chemistry from that?
Well, when that higher intellectual understanding was lost or ignored, people started focusing only on the physical operations. The symbols were taken completely literally. You get the puffers and charcoal burners, as they were sometimes called, practical operators, obsessed only with material results, manipulating substances without understanding the deeper principles. Modern chemistry, in this narrative, descends directly from that deviation.
So it's a corruption, a profound misunderstanding that took the shell and discarded the essence.
Precisely. It's the perfect example of reducing a multi-layered symbolic science down to its most grossly physical, measurable aspect.
And that defines modern science generally then, this confinement to the purely physical.
Yes. It limits itself strictly to the sensible world, the realm of multiplicity, change, quantity, things you can measure, count, weigh. Anything beyond that, unchanging principles, metaphysical truths, qualitative essence, is deemed unscientific or simply ignored.
Which means, from this perspective, it's fundamentally incomplete. It's missing the most important part.
Worse than incomplete, it becomes ignorant knowledge. Knowledge that is systematically ignorant of everything that lies beyond the material realm. It generates endless data, theories that constantly replace each other, huge amounts of information about phenomena.
But without connection to underlying principles, it doesn't lead to actual wisdom or understanding of fundamental reality.
That's the argument. It leads to this chaotic accumulation of details, this constant revision of hypotheses, which gives the illusion of progress, but it's more like churning within a cage. It produces immense material power, but very little stable intellectual truth.
And this lack of focus on truth itself points towards its real driving force in the modern world.
The utilitarian trap.
Yeah.
If the goal isn't truth for its own sake, what is it? Practical applications, utility, making things that work in the material world.
So science serves industry.
That's the ultimate reversal argued here. Industry becomes the sole reason and justification for science. Research funding, prestige, direction, it all gets geared towards immediate practical ends, towards generating technology, towards feeding the machine of production and consumption.
Which explains the obsession with facts, data, measurement, the superstition of facts, and the focus on quantity over quality. How many papers published, how many patents filed, how much economic growth generated.
Exactly, because quantitative results are the only ones that matter in a system geared towards material utility. Truth itself, being qualitative and non-material, gets sidelined.
Okay, this is a devastating critique. Science as ignorant knowledge driven by industry. What's the ultimate consequence of building our world on this kind of science? Where does it lead?
It leads, according to these sources, towards the ultimate catastrophe, because this relentless focus on mechanical invention and industrial application brings forces into play, forces whose real nature, whose deeper consequences, are completely unknown or ignored by the people using them.
We're playing with fire, basically, without understanding what fire really is beyond its immediate use for, say, cooking.
A good analogy. We unleash powerful physical forces, create vast ecological disturbances, develop weapons of unimaginable power, all based on a purely quantitative, materialistic understanding. We don't grasp the subtle, qualitative, or even spiritual repercussions of these actions.
And because this technological development is constantly accelerating, driven by the need for more action, more utility,
the risks escalate exponentially. It becomes highly probable, the sources suggest, that these very inventions, the tools of our supposed mastery over matter, will be the chief agents in the final catastrophe that brings this world cycle to its end.
Will be crushed by the very material forces we sought to control. A truly ironic end.
The logical end, from this perspective of prioritizing brute quantitative action over guiding qualitative knowledge, the progress becomes the mechanism of collapse.
Wow. Okay. We absolutely have to pause here for a second. If what we're exploring today is hitting you like it's hitting me, if it's making you question everything you thought you knew about progress and history,
then please do us a huge favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive, and maybe share this with someone whose mind could also use a little rearranging.
And seriously, if you want to go even deeper into these kinds of ideas, connect with the community exploring this stuff, and get access to exclusive content, definitely check out our memberships. Your support makes these deep dives possible.
Okay, so we've seen how science is framed as a corruption, but the critique doesn't stop there. Next up, the social order. What happens when you apply the same materialistic quantitative logic to how we govern ourselves? Let's talk about democracy.
Oh boy. This should be interesting. The illusion of democracy and the chaos it supposedly creates. After this. 3. The illusion of democracy and social chaos.
All right, shifting gears from science to society to governance. The same core principles, or rather, the reversal of principles, applies. And it starts with that fundamental traditional idea about power.
Which was, power comes from above, not from below.
Exactly. True power must come from above. It needs legitimacy from a higher source, spiritual authority, divine right, connection to unchanging principles, whatever form it takes historically. The temporal power needs sanction from something superior to it.
Why? Why can't power come from the people?
Because of that basic hierarchical logic, the greater cannot proceed from the lesser. the people, the multitude, the collection of individuals, they simply do not possess the principle of authority within themselves to confer it upwards. You can't give something you don't have.
So from that standpoint, the very definition of democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, is
a logical impossibility. A contradiction in terms. It cannot have a real de facto existence. The same group cannot be simultaneously the rulers and the ruled.
But it feels like we were ruled by the people through voting representation.
That's the illusion, according to this critique. The genius of the modern system, run by those actually in charge, whoever they may be, is convincing the populace that they are governing themselves. Devices like universal suffrage are presented as the source of power.
But they're actually just tools for managing the population.
Tools for manufacturing opinion, shaping consent, making people feel like they're in charge, while the real levers of power are elsewhere. Public opinion, the will of the people, isn't some spontaneous force. It's something that can be guided, molded, directed through mass media, education, psychological suggestion.
So the will of the people just reflects the narratives pushed by those who control the information flow.
Largely, yes. And if true power descends from unity, from principle, the top, then democracy, which claims to draw power from the multitude, from quantity, the bottom, is fundamentally based on the opposite principle. It's based on the law of matter and brute force.
Why matter? How does democracy connect to matter?
Matter, in these traditional views, is the principle of division, multiplicity, quantity, inertia. It's inherently chaotic and passive. Democracy takes the sheer number of people, a purely quantitative measure, and tries to make it the basis of legitimate authority, the source of law and quality.
It's governance by quantity.
Yeah.
Just like science became knowledge by quantity.
Exactly. It's the social equivalent of materialism. And this inevitably leads to the exclusion of competence.
Oh.
Think about it. If law and policy are determined by the majority opinion, what is that opinion based on? Is the majority typically expert in statecraft, metaphysics, long-term strategy, or complex social dynamics?
Probably not.
Right. The opinion of the majority, almost by definition, when dealing with specialized or higher order knowledge, represents incompetence. Mass psychology shows that collective opinion tends to gravitate towards the lowest common denominator, driven by emotion, suggestion, and immediate concerns, not deep understanding.
So democracy inherently sidelines genuine expertise, especially expertise related to principles or non-material realities.
It has to, because a true elite, meaning those with superior knowledge or spiritual insight, not just power, is always, by definition, the few. The concept of a qualitative elite is fundamentally opposed to the quantitative, egalitarian basis of democracy, which levels everything down in the name of the majority.
Okay, but societies still seem to have elites, right? People with power and influence.
Of course. Nature abhors a vacuum. Since the true intellectual or spiritual elite is either non-existent, hidden, or ignored in the modern world, it gets replaced by substitutes. False elites.
And what defines these false elites? What's their basis for superiority?
Given the materialistic, quantitative nature of the civilization, what do you think?
Money.
Bingo. Wealth. It's the perfect measure of superiority for a civilization obsessed with matter and quantity. It's measurable, it's external, it relates directly to material power and control over production and resources.
So the new aristocracy is the plutocracy. The rule of the rich.
It's the only form of elite status fully consistent with the underlying principles, or lack thereof, of the system. The pursuit of wealth, material comfort, and power becomes the driving force, leading to that struggle for existence, the competition and social strife that characterize the age.
So democracy isn't the path to freedom and enlightenment, but rather the political expression of materialism leading to rule by the incompetent majority, masked by the manufactured consent steered by a plutocratic elite.
That's the provocative argument laid out in these sources, yes. It paints a picture of modern society as inherently unstable, chaotic, and built upon a fundamental lie about the nature of power and competence. Just like its science, its social order is seen as a symptom of the Kali-Yuga's decline.
Okay, so the whole structure science, governance, is portrayed as fundamentally flawed, materialistic, heading for a crash. Was there anything left in the West that held on to the older, traditional principles, any potential point of resistance or restoration?
Historically, the sources often point to one institution as the last major outward repository of the traditional spirit in the West, the Catholic Church.
Why the church specifically?
Because, doctrinally at least, it maintained a continuity with certain pre-modern principles. It preserved a metaphysical framework, a hierarchy, a connection, in theory, to superhuman revelation. The core doctrine remained intact even if its understanding or application waned. It held a latent potential for restoration.
Latent potential. That sounds precarious. Did the modern anti-traditional spirit just leave it alone?
Of course not. The same forces we've discussed, individualism, the elevation of action and sentiment over intellect, the demand for utility inevitably began to infiltrate the church itself. This became a major internal threat.
Is this what was historically known as modernism within the church? That movement around the turn of the 20th century?
That was a key manifestation, yes. Modernism was essentially an attempt to reconcile traditional doctrine with the prevailing anti-traditional outlook of the modern world, to update it to make it compatible with individualism, rationalism, and later, sentimentalism.
And how did that manifest? What was the core effect of this infiltration?
A growing indifference to doctrine. Doctrine represents the intellectual core, the unchanging truths. As the modern mind finds pure intellectuality difficult or irrelevant, the focus shifts away from doctrine towards, well, other things.
Like what?
Moralism and custom. Reducing religion primarily to ethics rules about behavior and to social activities, rituals performed out of habit rather than deep understanding. The emphasis moves from truth to goodness, defined often in sentimental or utilitarian terms, and belonging.
So the hard intellectual core gets softened, diluted, replaced by feeling and social convention.
That's the trend described. If the doctrine, the intellectual heart, is forgotten or downplayed, only the lowest, most external, and most sentimental aspects of the religious impulse remain active for the majority.
Okay, this leads directly to something we hear a lot about today, a kind of caveat or observation people make about the state of the church now. The idea that it seems to be increasingly aligned with or falling prey to what some call a woke and leftist mindset. How does this framework explain that specific contemporary phenomenon?
It explains it as the latest and entirely logical consequence of that long-term loss of intellectuality. It's not seen as some sudden external attack, but the predictable outcome of the internal decay.
How so? Walk me through the logic.
Remember the hierarchy. Spirit, intellect at the top, guiding everything. If that highest principle, the focus on superhuman, unchanging doctrine, becomes latent, obscured, or neglected within the institution,
then the institution defaults to operating at a lower level.
Exactly. It defaults to addressing the most pressing concerns of its environment, but filtered through the prevailing mindset of that environment. And what is the prevailing mindset of the late Kali-Yuga?
Materialism, quantity, social agitation, focus on the collective, sentimentalism.
Precisely. So when the spiritual power is latent, the institution naturally gravitates towards addressing issues of material inequality, social justice defined in purely horizontal terms, collective grievances, emotional appeals, the dominant concerns of a materialistic and fragmented society. It starts to reflect the chaos rather than providing a transcendent anchor against it.
So, prioritizing contemporary social or political issues over timeless doctrine is actually a sign that the institution itself has succumbed to the very materialistic, infrarational mindset it was supposed to counteract.
That is exactly the argument. The spiritual power remains theoretically present in the doctrine, available for those individuals who can still access it intellectually, but the institution as a whole, in its outward manifestation and focus, increasingly mirrors the confusion of the age because its own intellectual vitality is diminished. It's operating in a kind of default materialistic mode, IVB, Western encroachment, and global chaos.
Okay, so the West, having fundamentally corrupted its own intellectual and spiritual traditions, is now exporting this model.
That's the next stage of the diagnosis, Western encroachment. It started centuries ago with colonialism, trade, political dominance. But the far more dangerous force, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, is the invasion of minds.
Spreading the Western way of thinking, the materialism, the individualism.
Exactly. Poisoning the intellectual wells of other civilizations, particularly in the East, which often retain traditional structures for longer.
So you see people from Eastern cultures becoming thoroughly Westernized, adopting the materialism, the scientific utilitarianism, the political ideologies.
And often, tragically, rejecting their own profound traditional wisdom in the process. They become denatured, cut off from their roots, and ironically, often become the most fervent agents of this Western-style dissolution within their own societies.
The sources use some pretty strong language to describe this global spread of the modern Western outlook, right?
Extremely strong. It describes Western encroachment, defined as the spread of materialism in all its forms, as being fundamentally satanic in nature.
Okay, we need to unpack that word carefully. Satanic here doesn't necessarily mean devil worship with horns and pitchforks in a literal sense, does it? What's the philosophical meaning in this context?
Right, it's crucial to understand it metaphysically, not just moralistically. Satan literally means the adversary, the opposer, the one who inverts or negates. In traditional cosmology, the satanic force represents the principle of negation, subversion, illusion, and the tendency towards disintegration, darkness, and pure multiplicity, the downward pull towards chaos, away from principial unity. In the Hindu system, you might relate it to the dissolving force of tamas.
So because the modern West is founded on the negation of higher principles, its global influence inherently spreads this negating, dissolving, materializing force across the planet. It acts as the primary vehicle for the adversary in this cosmic cycle.
That's the core argument. It's spreading the spirit of materialism, individualism, and quantitative thinking, actively undermining whatever traditional structures and knowledge remain elsewhere. It accelerates the global descent into the Kali-Yuga's final stages.
And the end point of this process. For a world built on negation, exporting negation.
The conclusion drawn is stark but logical. The modern world, fundamentally divided against itself, like the house divided in the gospel, which cannot stand, driven by insatiable material appetites and the chaotic forces it has blindly unleashed through its own technology, will come to a tragic end.
The prophecy, if you will, is self-destruction.
It's presented as an inevitability. Those who sought to dominate matter through purely material means, having cut themselves off from the guiding principles of spirit, will ultimately be devoured by those same material forces they thought they controlled. The very instruments of their supposed triumph become the agents of their demise. The universal order, the hierarchy, eventually reasserts itself, even if it's through dissolution and collapse.
Okay, that's a bleak picture.
Yeah.
If the trajectory of the current world order is towards this inevitable cataclysm, this state of dissolution, is there anything meaningful individuals or groups can do? Or is it just abandon ship?
Well, trying to reverse the entire cycle to halt the Kali-Yuga midway, the sources are clear. That's impossible. The downward momentum is too great. The cycle must run its course. Trying to fix the modern world using its own tools, politics, activism, technology, is seen as futile, like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
So what is the viable path, then, for someone who recognizes this decline and doesn't want to just be swept away by it?
The only way forward highlighted is an internal one, primarily. A complete restoration of intellectuality, a turning away from the modern, anti-traditional outlook, and a conscious return towards the traditional perspective, towards first principles.
Reconnecting with that higher knowledge, that intellectual intuition we talked about.
Exactly. Because that's the only force considered capable of bringing order out of chaos, of unifying the multiplicity. It has to start with intellectual reform, not political action.
But how does that translate into practice? Does everyone just become a hermit meditating?
Not necessarily. The crucial task described, especially as the end of the cycle approaches, is the formation and preservation of an intellectual elite.
An elite. That word has negative connotations today.
Understood. But here it means elite in the original sense. The best, the most qualified intellectually and spiritually. Not based on wealth or power, but on genuine understanding of principles. This elite would likely be numerically small, perhaps very small, but potentially powerful in a different way. They are the seed of the future.
The seed. Meaning they carry the potential for the next cycle.
Precisely. Their task isn't primarily to save this world from its inevitable end, but to preserve the essential knowledge and principles so that they aren't completely lost in the collapse.
So what would this elite actually do, if not politics or activism?
Their influence would be primarily invisible. They wouldn't engage in outward agitation or try to seize temporal power. Instead, they would aim to act as the unmoved mover does, directing things subtly from the level of principles by the sheer force of concentrated knowledge and spiritual influence.
Influencing the cause, knowledge, ideas, rather than wrestling with the effects, politics, social issues.
Exactly. An unseen power, intensified because it's focused on unity and principle, not dispersed in worldly action. They would work to maintain the connection to the superhuman source of wisdom.
It sounds like safeguarding something precious through the storm.
That's the perfect metaphor.
Yeah.
Their work ensures the preservation of the ark of tradition. This ark contains the essential non-human wisdom, the timeless principles that cannot perish even if civilizations rise and fall.
And this preserved knowledge, carried through the darkness by this intellectual elite,
becomes the germs of the next world cycle. When the current Dark Age finally dissolves, this seed of knowledge provides the foundation, the starting point for the new Golden Age to begin. The ultimate goal is profoundly long-term, ensuring the continuity of tradition across the cycles.
So here we are, deep in the Kali-Yuga, according to this ancient perspective. A civilization built on a reversal of principles, obsessed with action over knowledge, matter over spirit. The sources even warn that as the end approaches, the infernal powers, the forces of illusion and dissolution become more active, creating signs and wonders to confuse even those trying to find truth.
And we have to ask ourselves, looking around at our world driven by technology, consumption, constant agitation, if the endpoint of this modern trajectory is, as some suggest, becoming little more than a cog in the machine, a tool for making tools, utterly enslaved to the material world we've created.
Then what is that hidden knowledge, that timeless wisdom supposedly preserved in the Ark of Tradition that we desperately need to rediscover right now? What understanding must we reclaim if we want any chance of breaking free from this purely material destiny, this downward spiral of the Kali-Yuga, and perhaps aligning ourselves with the eternal truths that endure beyond the collapse of worlds?
The challenge is immense, but the potential prize reconnection with truth itself is infinite. Vincit omnia veritas. Truth conquers all.
Think about that. Thank you for joining us on this very deep dive. We'll see you next time.